Celebrities, CEOs, veterans, and students have learned through transcendental meditation that we can all live in a world free of worry. This is Success Without Stress with Bob Roth on Sirius XM Indie 104.
Hi, this is Bob Roth. I'm with Success Without Stress on Sirius XM Radio, Indie 104. And my guest today is Tom North, who happens to be a good friend, but also an author. He's a writer, a poet, an adventurer, and he's the 11th of 20 Beardsley children made famous in the film Yours, Mine, and Ours. And Tom has an extraordinary story to tell. I wish it was a unique one, but it's extraordinary, and we're going to have a chance to, as if, go behind the scenes here. Tom was a victim of domestic violence growing up. And we'd like to think that that's a rare occasion or it only happens, in some of the tougher neighborhoods, but it's widespread. And traumatic experiences growing up skew our lives. It undermines our brain functioning. It destroys our health, actually, and it can skew our life. And Tom has an interesting story about what it was like to grow up in a very famous family on the outside, but the sort of the horrors and the hells behind the scenes. And we're not featuring Tom, and Tom hasn't written a book just to talk about that. It's another story of a person who had a tough life growing up in a famous family, but more for the angle or the idea that Tom found a solution, and that's meditation, transcendental meditation, which we talk a lot about on this show. So, Tom, we're just going to go right into this thing. Give the listener some background. A person who's maybe, born in 1975, doesn't know anything about the Beardsley family. Give us a short background. Tell us the story.
Sure. Thank you, Bob. So the background is this, that in 1960, my mother, Helen North, became a widow, and she was 30 years old and had 8 children. And she met a man named Frank Beardsley, who was a widower. He had 10 children, and they got married. So when you add 10 and 8, that's 18, and that's a heck of a big family. What happened is that it caught the attention of the media, and Lucille Ball called my mother and stepfather and said, I want to make a movie about the merger of these two big families. So she did that, and the movie was called Yours, Mine, and Ours, hence the title of my book, which is True North, The Shocking Truth About Yours, Mine, and Ours. When Lucy made the film, of course, it was classic Lucille Ball, so it was funny, it was entertaining, it was warm-hearted, and it was a wonderful film. In fact, it was the 4th highest-grossing film of 1968. So it was a critical and box office success, and the public came to expect that the family experience was a representation, or I should say the film was a representation of the family experience, which was 180 degrees the other direction from the truth. What was happening in the actual family life was that Frank Beardsley was psychotic, and so he was a dangerous person to be around. And for children, that creates a very traumatic environment. And so we were subjected to domestic violence and child abuse on a daily basis. So not only were we having to deal with an impossible domestic environment, but we had to support a fantasy that was promoted by Hollywood. And that, for lack of a better term, is just crazy making. So that's the backstory of the Beardsley household in a nutshell.
Tell us, I grew up in the 50s and 60s in the Bay Area, and, my parents fought, and sometimes, I'd hear them arguing or fighting. I don't know how many people really know, what do you mean domestic abuse, and what was that like? When did you suddenly realize something is wrong here? Tell me a little bit about what it's like to be 10 years old in a family like that, and why is that relevant to today?
When I was a child and my mother married Frank Beardsley, I had a fairly a pleasant, a very loving domestic environment to grow up in for the first 6 years of my life. My parents, Richard North and Helen North, were very much in love, as evidenced by a lot of hugging and kissing and laughter in the home and playing with their children, and it was a very wonderful domestic environment. When my dad died and my mother married Frank Beardsley, when I was introduced to him as my new dad, I said, well, I don't necessarily want a new dad. And he put his face in my face, and with clenched teeth, he said, well, I am your new dad, whether you like it or not. And
Okay.
you will address me as sir from now on.
Now, did you see that coming? How old were you when that happened? You were 6 years old?
I was 7 when my mother married Frank Beardsley, and I didn't see it coming.
Was he like, during the courtship, was he like a nice guy?
He tried to be a nice guy, but his only response to any resistance of any kind was violence and rage. And so, for example, when I would come around a corner of the house in the hallway, and there he would be, I went into immediate panic mode because I really didn't know what he was going to do. And it was not uncommon for him to knock me across the room, and I would get up and say, "What was that for?" And he would say, "Just for drill."
Whew. Now,
That was the environment.
Now, I saw in an interview, and you talk about this, that you wanted to eat dinner with all 20 kids because there was safety in numbers rather than being able to be picked off. Talk about that. Talk about that.
Yeah, that's correct. So there was, to a degree, when I had to be in the house, there was safety in numbers, and I just made sure that I put children between me and Frank Beardsley, and then stayed out of his way as much as I could. And as I write in the book, I was like a deer at the pond. The deer bends down and takes a drink, and then looks up and looks around to see if there's any predators around. And that's the way I was in the Beardsley household, always looking to make sure Frank Beardsley wasn't around, if at all possible.
The book, by the way, is True North, The Shocking Truth About Yours, Mine, and Ours. It's an inspirational story of survival and hope, and I encourage all the listeners to purchase this. It's beautifully written. You write it yourself?
I did.
Yes, very, very well written. How is this book relevant to a person who doesn't remember the Beardsleys, but they're hearing this interview or they're going to pick up your book? Is the problem of domestic violence, is the problem of what you're talking about when you go around the country and you speak everywhere and you're a brilliant speaker? Do people resonate with this? Is the problem of domestic violence worse now than ever before?
My story in the context of this book, what's interesting is that readers come back to me and immediately they reflect on their own experience. Because for each person, the most important person in their lives is themselves. And they immediately reflect on their own experience, and they typically say, "Thank you for writing this book. You've given me a voice I never had."
Now, we're going to transition. So your life is a hell from the age of 7 until when?
18.
18. And then what were you doing? Were you taking drugs? Were you self-medicating? Were you in therapy? What were you doing to be able to cope with your hell that you're living?
So I have to qualify my response there, Bob, because I left home at the age of 18, but I continued my contact on a regular basis with the family until I was 22. And I was self-medicating with recreational drugs all during my teen years, and I continued to work in the family business, which was a donut shop. And I made donuts 3 or 4 days a week. And then a few days a week, I had another job. In fact, I had 2 other jobs so that I could make money because none of us were paid to work in the donut shop. But I was constantly self-medicating with recreational drugs. I was a wreck. I was depressed. And as any drug user will tell you, the more drugs you take, the more drugs it takes to get the same effect. And after 5 years of self-medicating with recreational drugs, I was reaching that point of diminishing returns. And so I was looking for a solution to this because I knew I was damaging my body and my mind. And a friend of mine introduced me to transcendental meditation. And
You were how old?
I was 22 years old.
And you were living in Southern California?
I was living in Carmel.
Carmel.
And this was 1975. And so I was working 3 jobs and stressing myself out all the time, and it was time for me to make a change.
So a friend says, Tom, transcendental meditation, and was that something that resonated with you? Was that something, oh, that's hippie stuff? Or was that something you were, oh gosh, I've been looking and this is something I want to give a try?
You know, I remember it, Bob, like it was yesterday. I said to my friend, if it's that good, you're in a dangerous place because you're standing between me and the door. And I went right down to the TM Center and learned to practice TM.
So how would you describe transcendental meditation in a few words to our audience?
When I began to practice TM, it was nothing short of miraculous. I experienced a release of tension and anxiety immediately. And the example that I can give you to illustrate that is that I was so bound up inside prior to learning to practice TM that I couldn't give a compliment. And so that evening, after I had learned TM, I went to visit the kids, my younger brothers and sisters, at the family home. And my sister was going out on a date, and she looked very cute, and I complimented her, and she stopped and looked at me because a compliment was something that never happened in the Beardsley household. And I shocked myself. So that was a very simple thing to do, but it wasn't a common thing in the Beardsley household, and I shocked myself by giving a compliment.
I have several more questions, but I'm going to give a quick definition for you of transcendental meditation for our listeners. Transcendental meditation, many of you know this, I've been teaching it for over 40 years. Transcendental meditation is a simple, natural, effortless technique practiced about 15 to 20 minutes twice a day, sitting comfortably in a chair with the eyes closed. And in brief, it just gives access to a level of calm and silence that already exists deep within the mind, much like there are waves on the surface of the ocean, but at the depth of the ocean, it's naturally silent. So the surface of our mind is that worrying mind, the anxious mind, the planning mind, the regretful mind, the creative mind. It's just the waves on the surface, the gotta mind. But we hypothesize is that everyone has deep within a level where the mind is already calm and quiet, and transcendental meditation, unlike other forms of meditation, gives effortless access to that. And when we experience that effortlessly every time, move in that direction, body gains a state of rest and relaxation found to be far deeper than the deepest part of deep sleep. And that deep rest actually heals the brain. It actually allows the body to throw off stress, and research shows that connections between the frontal lobe, which is the executive functioning of the brain, and that is the rational filter against impulsive behavior, and that is our judgment and decision-making and sense of self. When when we've been traumatized or under stress, that frontal part of the brain goes offline, and then we're just reactionary and just describing what Tom North has been saying. It's you feel traumatized and scared and afraid always. And so the meditation heals the brain, releases stress, and it's used widely now in businesses across the country. It's offered in schools and in prisons. I don't mean to put business school and prisons all in the same line there. They're slightly different. But anyway, so now back to, and it's not a philosophy, Tom, and it's not a religion, and it's not a change in lifestyle. There's nothing you need to believe in. Anyone can do this. So now, you started meditating at 22. You're how old now?
I'm 60.
So you're 60. So 38 years, over those 38 years, how has the meditation helped you? What kind of changes has it brought about? And has it been the meditation, or is it just natural maturing? Tell me how the meditation has helped you. Because when I read your literature and your books, you really credit, you say, transcendental meditation put you on the road to healing. And
I was a broken soul at the time that I learned TM, and it really saved my life. In fact, I have a big grin on my face right now, Bob, because I'm sitting at my computer and I'm writing an article titled 9 Ways TM Improves My Life. And so I've been asked by a magazine to write this article, and so I was just working on that. So when I came out of this deep, deep, dark place and began to practice TM, it was just a daily improvement, one meditation at a time, 20 minutes twice a day. And I just started to see my life open up. And people began to say, there's something different about you. What are you doing? And I would tell them what I learned to practice TM. And just as an aside, actually 11 of my family members learned to practice TM as well.
Really?
Yes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. So it improves my life on every single level, whether it's psychologically, physiologically, emotionally, in business, in terms of spiritual growth, in every respect, in terms of relationships. When you take the stress away from those aspects of life, naturally our tendency towards greater and greater enjoyment is allowed to express itself. And that's been my experience over these 38 years.
You describe yourself, or you are described as a poet and an adventurer, and that you have you've written extensively on scuba diving, jade hunting in the wilds of Big Sur. Tell me about some of your adventures there. And does meditation have a role in giving you sort of reflection or self-confidence to be able to go off on these adventures? And where are the wait a minute, where are the wilds of Big Sur? I know Big Sur. There are wilds that you can go hunting there?
Oh, well, actually, Big Sur is a very, very...
That's in California. That's on the California coast. Yeah.
Big Sur, California. And it's a very dramatic environment. There are giant redwoods and huge forests of them. There are mountains that rise from the sea level to about 2,200 feet of elevation. And Big Sur gets about 44 inches of rain a year because of that. So we have lush, temperate rainforests there. And the ocean itself is extremely dramatic. We have the giant waves during the wintertime. But for about a 4-mile stretch of the Big Sur coastline, it's extremely mineralized. And part of that mineralization is jade. And this is nephrite jade that juts out of the cliffside into the ocean, where it's constantly broken off and tumbled in the surf. And there's a whole subculture of people out here who go jade collecting, and so I've been one of those people most of my life.
Talking to Tom North, the author of True North, The Shocking Truth About Yours, Mine, and Ours, which is the name of a blockbuster film in 1968 about the Beardsley family with 20 kids. And on the surface, a film was made with Henry Fonda and Lucille Ball, and it was portrayed a very happy family. And Tom was in the middle of that family, one of 20 kids, and it was a hell. And he's written a book, not just to sort of dirty laundry on family and friends, but to give a message of hope, I found from reading the book, because the problem of domestic violence is pervasive in our culture, and it's often not talked about. And yes, we talk about murders and suicides, and we talk about, robberies and that violence, but the internal violence, you describe it as a prison. And Tom tells a story about how he found transcendental meditation to be able to put him on a path to healing. I want to go back to the sort of your message, like, your parting shot, your parting to an audience, some of whom may be living in right now in degrees of that hell, who don't know what to do, who don't know what action to take. Are there organizations they can reach out to, government organizations, social services, that, and your final comments on transcendental meditation?
So it's a great direction to go in, Bob. the main message of the book is that we can take the broken pieces of a traumatic life and put them back together and become happy, healthy, well-adjusted, productive people. And we just have to want to. So in order to facilitate that recovery, there are agencies that can be of help. There is, for children, there's a group that I am a national sponsor of called CASA, which is Court-Appointed Special Advocates for Children. And actually, in the back of my book, there is a resource guide. So if your listeners are interested in finding something in their area, they can look at the resource guide in the back of True North, and they will find something in their area. I would like to emphasize, though, that my suggestion is that you go to tm.org and look up Transcendental Meditation in your community, because it is available all across the country.
I really thank you very much for taking the time, Tom. You are motivating and inspiring human being and speaker. You've overcome enormous odds, against enormous odds. But more than just overcoming, you are, I don't need me to tell you, dedicating your life to uplift the millions of other people who face similar odds and live in a prison of domestic violence, for which, when you're young, you see no escape, you see no out. So I have been talking with Tom North, who's the author of True North, The Shocking Truth About Yours, Mine, and Ours. I really encourage our listeners to pick up that book. You're going to learn a lot, not just for yourself, but if you have a friend or family or colleague who is trapped in a violently dysfunctional relationship, this is an excellent book. This is Bob Roth, your host of Success Without Stress on Sirius XM Indie 104.
This is Success Without Stress with Bob Roth on Sirius XM Indie 104.